As the 20th century opened, China was in turmoil. Corruption was widespread. Opium addiction was endemic. Rebellion, drought, and famine claimed the lives of 60 million Chinese. Foreign nations had divvied up the empire into spheres of influence, areas where one country had exclusive rights to trade, invest, and had special political rights.
So explain what spheres of influence were. Remember, as you watch the video, you can pause for as long as you need, rewind, do whatever
With a coaling base in the Philippines just 400 miles from China, American businesses hoped to take advantage of China's vast resources and sell to her vast market. John Hay, then U.S. Secretary of State, had a brilliant idea. He sent letters to all the foreign powers suggesting an open-door policy in China. This policy would help U.S. businesses by guaranteeing equal trading rights for all, preventing one nation from discriminating against another. At the same time, the open-door policy maintained the territorial integrity of China, an idea that appealed to anti-imperialists at home. Other powers politely put Hay off, saying that while an open-door policy is a good idea in principle, they had no way of enforcing it. However, Hay, despite the debate, boldly announced that everyone had agreed to the policy. Everyone, that is, except China.
So what motivated the United States, first of all, to become involved in China?
Cixi, Empress Dowager of the Qing dynasty, was eager to rid her empire of these foreigners. In northern Shandong province, a secret society known as the Fists of Righteous Harmony attracted thousands of followers. They, too, wanted to rid China of foreign influences, but they also sought to throw off the yoke of the corrupt Chinese government. Foreigners called members of this society boxers because they practiced martial arts. Boxers believed that through meditation and discipline, they could cloak themselves in a mystical shield, so foreign bullets could not harm them. The Empress welcomed the boxers as China's defenders and turned their fury squarely against the foreign community. In June 1900, the boxers began their bloody campaign. They murdered hundreds of foreign missionaries and Chinese Christian converts, destroying millions of dollars worth of property. About 900 foreigners blockaded themselves in their embassies for nearly 2 months, repelling waves of boxers.
Ammunition, food, and medical supplies were almost gone. Then shortly before dawn, loud explosions rocked the city. Weary defenders staggered to the barricades expecting a final, overpowering boxer attack.
But instead, relief had arrived. Troops from Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and the U.S. fought their way into Peking to free their countrymen and put down the rebellion. The boxers, believing they were impervious to bullets, were cut down by the thousands. On September 7, 1901, China and 11 other nations signed the Boxer Protocol, snuffing out the rebellion.
So what were the goals of the Boxers, and what actually happened to them and to their rebellion?
Foreign policy at the turn of the century was characterized by 3 vastly different philosophies. Theodore Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, William Taft's dollar diplomacy, and Woodrow Wilson's moral diplomacy. Theodore Roosevelt abided by the African proverb, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." He applied this big stick theory to American foreign policy, believing the U.S. should take a strong role in Asia.
So what exactly was this big stick policy, and where did it apply?
1905, Roosevelt intervened to end the war between Russia and Japan over Korea and Manchuria. When Japan was angered by racist sentiment in the U.S., Roosevelt arranged a gentleman's agreement. He would see that Asian discrimination ended, but in turn, Japan would have to limit Japanese immigration to the U.S.
Define the gentleman's agreement and its terms.
In a show of growing U.S. naval might, Roosevelt launched 16 warships on a world tour. Painted brilliant white, the flotilla was known as the Great White Fleet. The tour was a triumph. The U.S. was regarded as the most potent naval power after the British.
What was the significance of Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, and why do you think he painted them white?
In the interest of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, Roosevelt turned his attention to a narrow strip of land in Colombia, the Isthmus of Panama. In 1903, Roosevelt's Secretary of State John Hay failed in an attempt to negotiate a treaty with Colombia for the land. But U.S. interests were not to be denied. Roosevelt backed the Panamanian Revolt and negotiated for the Panama Canal Zone. Work began. Massive locks were designed to raise ships through the mountains and then lower them on the other side. 1.53 million cubic meters of concrete were poured, 70,000 workers recruited, and $400 million was spent. A marvelous engineering achievement, the canal was finally completed in 1914, just in time for World War I.
So, what were the benefits of the Panama Canal to the United States, and how exactly did we get to build it?
In 1904, Roosevelt wielded his big stick again, adding a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Initiated in 1823, the Monroe Doctrine established a policy to limit European expansion into the Western Hemisphere. Roosevelt's corollary went further. It stated that the U.S. had the right to intervene militarily to keep European powers out of the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt corollary.
So define both the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary, and why do you think Roosevelt was
exercised the very next year in 1905 in order to relieve the Dominican Republic's debt to threatening foreign creditors. In 1909, when William Howard Taft succeeded Roosevelt as president, he established a foreign policy encouraging U.S. investment in Latin America and China as a way of discouraging European investment. In contrast to Roosevelt's big stick policy, this new policy became known as dollar diplomacy. As a result, U.S.-owned businesses came to dominate the economies of many small nations in Central America, the Caribbean, and parts of South America. Latin Americans reacted with anger and resentment, but they were...
So what exactly was dollar diplomacy, and why were the Latin Americans so resentful of it?
powerless in the face of the U.S. military. In 1913, Woodrow Wilson succeeded Taft as president. Wilson offered yet another approach to foreign policy. He rejected big stick and dollar diplomacy in favor of a moral diplomacy, applying a moral standard and not recognizing any government that is undemocratic or hostile to U.S. interests.
So what was moral diplomacy?
To protect U.S. business interests, Wilson rallied troops to stabilize Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and Cuba, effectively turning them into U.S. protectorates. Wilson encountered failure in his dealings with Mexico. In the late 19th century, corruption in Mexico was prevalent, escalating with the assassination of Mexico's president, Francisco Madero, in 1913, and the assumption of power by Victoriano Huerta. Not wanting to support a government by murder, Wilson refused to dignify Huerta's government.
I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men.
President Wilson mobilized U.S. Marines to capture the port of Veracruz in Mexico. Although split over allegiance to Huerta, Mexicans were united in their opposition to U.S. invasion, and war was barely averted between the two countries. In 1916, when Mexican rebel Pancho Villa raided a U.S. border town and killed U.S. citizens, an expeditionary force of 11,000 men, under the leadership of General John J. Pershing, crossed into Mexico to hunt for Villa. After a year-long pursuit, Pershing's expedition was called off, but the affair increased anti-American sentiments. U.S. troops withdrew in 1917, and tensions eventually eased between Mexico and the U.S. The United States forcibly entered the new century as an imperial power. In little more than a century, a nation founded on freedom discovered itself embroiled in troubling relationships with the peoples of its new territories and
So America
protectorates.
becomes
Despite
imperialistic,
the turmoil,
and this is
America
just the
had
beginning.
emerged from its historic isolation, a newborn world power.
See you next time.